The moment I realized Sandra Peoples had set up a wedding reception on my property without asking, I was standing at the tree line with a cup of coffee gone cold in my hand, watching 200 people in formal wear drink champagne on land my father had broken his back to keep. Tent poles driven into my soil, catering trucks parked across my access road, a string quartet playing something expensive near my equipment shed. And Sandra herself, in a mother-of-the-bride dress, the color of overripe peaches, directing staff like she owned every inch of it. She did not own 1 inch of it, but she was about to learn what I owned. My name is Walter Greer. I'm 57 years old, third-generation farmer in central Tennessee, and the 84 acres I work have been in my family since my grandfather bought them off a bank auction in 1951 with money he'd saved in a coffee can under floorboard. Soybeans, corn, hay, and a small herd of cattle that my father built up and I've maintained. It is not a scenic venue. It is not a wedding destination. It is a working farm with mud and diesel and manure and all the other honest things that come with land that actually produces something. When Clover Ridge Estates went up around my eastern boundary 4 years ago, I knew trouble was coming. Developments always bring the same package. Nice houses, people who moved out of the city for the countryside aesthetic, and then immediate resentment toward the actual countryside once they realize it smells like what it is. My farm predated every one of those houses by 7 decades. I had been here longer than their subdivision had been a concept. That didn't matter to Sandra Peoples. Sandra had moved into Clover Ridge 2 years back, inserted herself into the HOA within 6 months, and been running it like a personal fiefdom ever since. She was one of those women who treated every shared space like her own living room and every boundary like a suggestion made by people who didn't understand her vision. She had complained about my tractor noise at 6 in the morning, which is when farmers operate tractors. She had submitted a formal HOA grievance about the smell from my cattle operation, which is what cattle smell like. She had written 3 letters to the county asking about rezoning possibilities for agricultural land adjacent to residential developments, which I found out about through a friend at the planning office who called me as a courtesy. Sandra didn't want a neighbor, she wanted a view. The HOA letters started in my 2nd month of knowing her. Fence line maintenance request, vegetation overgrowth visible from Clover Ridge perimeter, dust from farm equipment creating air quality concerns for residents. Each one I read, filed, and ignored because none of them had legal standing. My farm operated under agricultural zoning with all the protections that designation carries in Tennessee, including the Right to Farm Act, which essentially means I can operate my farm like a farm regardless of what residential neighbors think about it. Sandra apparently hadn't read that particular piece of legislation. What she had done, as I eventually pieced together, was decide that my land was an amenity rather than a property. She'd driven past it enough times to see the open meadow along the east fence, the old oak grove near the creek, the way the light came down on the property on clear evenings. And somewhere in the space between what she wanted and what was real, she decided the line between her subdivision and my farm was softer than it actually was. The wedding belonged to her daughter, Courtney. I found out about Courtney's engagement the way I found out about most things in Clover Ridge, through my neighbor Helen Marsh, a retired teacher who lived in the subdivision's first row of houses and had appointed herself a kind of informal intelligence channel between our 2 worlds. Helen called me on a Thursday evening in March to mention that Sandra had been talking at the HOA meeting about using the farm meadow for Courtney's June wedding. I assumed Sandra meant she was going to ask me. I assumed wrong. I never received a call, a letter, a knock on the door, or any communication of any kind from Sandra Peoples regarding her daughter's wedding. What I did receive in May was a notification from the County Events Permit Office asking me to confirm that I was the property owner granting permission for a private event on my acreage on June 14th. I called the permit office back within the hour. The woman on the phone told me a Sandra Peoples had submitted a permit application listing my property as an approved venue with owner consent. I told her there was no owner consent. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would need to flag the application as contested and that the permit would be suspended pending verification. I thanked her and hung up and sat with what I'd just learned. Sandra had forged my consent on a county permit application. That was not an HOA dispute anymore. That was a falsified government document. I called my attorney, a man named Raymond Elks who had handled my father's estate and knew the farm's history as well as I did. Raymond listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is his way, and when I finished he said two things. First, that the forged permit was a serious matter that needed to be documented immediately. Second, that whatever I did next should be careful, measured, and leave the emotional response for after the legal one. I told him I was completely calm. He said that was what worried him. Raymond filed a formal complaint with the county permit office and sent a certified letter to Sandra notifying her that the consent on her application was fraudulent and that proceeding with any event on my property without authorization would constitute trespassing. The letter went out on a Monday. By Wednesday, I had not heard back from Sandra. By Friday, Helen called to tell me the wedding invitations had already gone out, and Sandra had told people at a neighborhood gathering that the permit situation was a misunderstanding being sorted out. A misunderstanding. I'd like you to hold that word in your mind while I describe what I found on the morning of June 14th. I was up at 4:30, which is my normal time. Coffee made, boots on, out to check the cattle before the heat came up. I walked my usual morning route east toward the meadow fence and stopped when I saw the lights. Generator lights, the portable kind, set up across at least 2 acres of my meadow. A catering tent the size of a small aircraft hangar. Tables being arranged by staff who had apparently been there since before dawn. A wooden dance floor assembled over my grass. Floral arrangements being placed on every surface available. I stood at the fence line for a long moment. 200 people were expected by noon. The caterers hadn't even looked up. I walked back to the house, poured out the cold coffee, made a fresh cup, and called Raymond at 5:15 in the morning, which tells you something about Raymond that he answered on the second ring. He said she went through with it. I said she went through with it. He said to document everything before I did anything else. Photos, video, timestamps. I said I already had my phone out. He said good. Then he said whatever I was thinking about doing, run it by him first. I told him what I was thinking about doing. There was a pause on the line. Then Raymond said, "Walter, that is either the best or worst idea I've ever heard, and I genuinely cannot decide which." I told him I'd call him after. Here is the thing about running a cattle operation. You generate manure. That is simply a fact of the enterprise. You generate it in quantity and you manage it in systems. I had a manure management operation on the west side of the property that processed waste from my herd and produced a fertilizer product I used on my own fields and occasionally sold to neighboring farms. The holding area, the spreader equipment, the whole system, fully legal, fully permitted, fully consistent with agricultural zoning. I had been planning to run a fertilizer application on the East Meadow in 2 weeks. I moved that schedule up. By 7 in the morning, I had the tractor running and the spreader loaded. I want to be precise here about what I did and did not do because the legal distinction matters. I did not trespass. I did not touch their equipment or their people. I did not interfere with any person on my property in a physical way. What I did was operate my equipment on my own land, in accordance with my agricultural permit, and apply fertilizer to my own East Meadow fields, starting at the north end and working methodically south. The smell arrived before the spreader did. I will tell you that the distance between a working cattle operations fertilizer product and a June wedding reception is not a large distance when the application is active. I will also tell you that the wind that morning was coming from the northwest at a steady 8 miles an hour, which I knew because I check wind conditions every morning before any field application. That is standard agricultural practice. By 7:45, I could hear the commotion from the equipment cab. I kept my lines straight and my application even the way my father taught me. You do not rush a field application. You do it right or you do it again. By 8:15, the catering staff had stopped setting up. By 8:40, Sandra Peoples was at my fence line in her mother-of-the-bride dress, screaming things I could not hear over the tractor engine, which was running exactly as loudly as a tractor engine runs, which is to say considerably. I completed my first pass of the north section, turned the tractor at the end of the row, and began the second pass. Sandra was on her phone. I was on my tractor. The wedding was scheduled for noon. At 9:30, with my application continuing in full compliance with my agricultural permits, the catering company made a decision. They began breaking down the tent. The dance floor came up in sections. Tables were loaded back onto trucks. Floral arrangements, hundreds of dollars of them, wilted in the morning heat while the northwest wind did its steady, unhurried work. At 10 o'clock, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived at my property line. I shut the tractor down, climbed out, and walked over. They asked me what I was doing. I told them I was applying fertilizer to my East Meadow field in accordance with my agricultural management permit, and I handed them a copy of that permit, which I had folded in my chest pocket that morning. They looked at the permit, they looked at the tractor, they looked at the remains of the wedding setup being loaded onto trucks in the background. One deputy said, "Sir, there's been a complaint about the odor." I said, "I imagine there has been." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Is this operation within your permitted parameters?" I said it was entirely within my permitted parameters and that I was happy to contact the county agricultural office if they needed verification. He said that wouldn't be necessary. The deputies left. I went back to the tractor. Courtney's wedding, it turned out, relocated to a Marriott banquet room in town, arranged in about 4 hours through what I can only imagine was a series of extremely stressful phone calls. Helen told me later that Sandra had spent most of that afternoon in her car making calls, and that the general consensus among the wedding guests, once the story made its way around, was that the whole situation was both a catastrophe and, depending on your relationship with Sandra, somewhat deserved. But the wedding being relocated was not the end of the story. Not even close. Because when I called Raymond that afternoon, he told me what he'd been doing while I was on the tractor. He had been preparing. The county permit office had already been in contact with him about the fraudulent consent documentation. Sandra's permit application was under active review, and Raymond had pulled something that morning that he described as very, very interesting. He said, "Walter, I need you to come into the office tomorrow." I asked him what he'd found. He said the event permit was the smallest piece of what Sandra had been doing. That was the first real twist. And the story that started with a forged permit and a ruined wedding was about to become something considerably larger. HOA Karen threw a wedding on my farm, so I turned it into a manure disaster. Raymond Elks had been my attorney for 11 years. In that time, I had seen him calm through an estate dispute that nearly split my extended family, steady through a boundary survey disagreement with a neighboring property, and completely unbothered during a zoning hearing that lasted 4 hours and involved 2 people crying. Raymond did not rattle. So when I walked into his office the morning after the wedding disaster and found him sitting forward in his chair with a legal pad full of notes and the particular alertness of a man who had been thinking hard since early morning, I understood that what he'd found was not small. He told me to sit down, and then he laid it out. The event permit application was only the most recent document Sandra had filed that involved my property. Raymond had pulled every county filing associated with my parcel number over the past 2 years, which is the kind of thing attorneys can do when they're motivated, and what he found was a pattern that went well beyond one forged permit. 14 months prior, Sandra had submitted a formal nuisance complaint to the county zoning office alleging that my farm operation was creating health hazards for Clover Ridge residents. That complaint, which I had never been formally notified about, had triggered a preliminary review. The review had generated a file. The file had been used as supporting documentation when someone, and the filing did not clearly identify who, had submitted a rezoning inquiry asking the county to evaluate whether my parcel's agricultural designation remained appropriate given the surrounding residential development. A rezoning inquiry. If my land lost its agricultural designation, the right to farm protections disappeared. The property value calculus shifted entirely, and an 84-acre parcel adjacent to an established subdivision, stripped of agricultural protection, became something developers would line up to discuss. Raymond spread the filing copies across his desk and walked me through the chain. The nuisance complaint, the preliminary review it triggered, the rezoning inquiry that referenced the review, and then the piece that made Raymond sit forward in his chair the same way I was now sitting forward in mine. The rezoning inquiry had been submitted by a limited liability company called Clover Ridge Land Partners. I asked Raymond if he knew who was behind that LLC. He said that was what he'd spent the morning finding out. The registered agent for Clover Ridge Land Partners was a man named Dennis Orwell, a real estate developer out of Nashville who had been involved in 3 residential developments in the county over the past decade. One of those developments was Clover Ridge Estates, the subdivision that Sandra Peoples lived in, the one whose HOA she ran. I sat with that for a moment. Sandra wasn't just an annoying neighbor running an HOA power trip. She was either connected to or actively working with the developer who had built her subdivision and who now had a financial interest in acquiring agricultural land adjacent to it. The nuisance complaint she filed created the paper trail that supported the rezoning inquiry that, if successful, would have stripped my land's protections and made it available for purchase and development. The wedding was theater, aggressive, intrusive, insulting theater, but the real operation was the paperwork running quietly through county offices while I was dealing with letters about fence lines and dust complaints. Raymond said, "I want to file a complaint with the county ethics office about the permit fraud, and separately I want a private investigator to run a full background on the relationship between Sandra Peoples and Clover Ridge Land Partners." I said, "Do both." He said there was one more thing. The rezoning inquiry had not been resolved. It was still sitting in the county planning office in preliminary status, which meant it hadn't moved forward, but it also hadn't been dismissed. As long as it sat there, it was a potential instrument. Someone could push it forward at any time with additional supporting documentation. I asked what kind of documentation would push it forward. Raymond said more nuisance complaints, more official-looking records of farm-related issues affecting the residential community, more of exactly what Sandra had been building with her HOA letters and county filings for the past 2 years. I understood then what the wedding had really been about, not just using my land, creating an incident, getting me to react in a way that generated a new complaint, a new official record, something else to add to the pile. A farmer who applied manure during a wedding could be portrayed as a harassment campaign against a residential community. That file could grow. I was glad I had stayed on my own land and operated within my permits. Raymond filed the ethics complaint on a Tuesday. The private investigator he hired was a woman named Carla Simmons who had worked insurance fraud cases for 20 years before going independent. She was methodical, expensive, and according to Raymond, the best at this specific kind of paper trail work in the state. Carla came back with her first report in 10 days. Sandra Peoples had worked for a property management company in Atlanta for 6 years before moving to Tennessee. That company had been a subsidiary of a development group. That development group had 2 partners. One of them had been an early investor in Clover Ridge Land Partners. Sandra had not stumbled into this neighborhood. She had been placed here. Not in a dramatic conspiracy sense, more in the way that people with shared financial interests tend to find themselves in proximity to those interests. She had moved into a development where an old professional contact had money. She had run for HOA president. She had started building a nuisance file against the one agricultural property that sat in the middle of the land the developer wanted. And she had done it gradually enough that from the outside it looked like ordinary neighborhood friction. Carla also found something in Sandra's public financial records that Raymond called the second thread. Sandra had received 2 payments from Clover Ridge Land Partners in the prior 18 months, listed in their filings as consulting fees, $4,500 each, $9,000 total, for consulting services that were never specified. $9,000 for filing nuisance complaints and forging county permits. Raymond said that depending on how the ethics investigation developed, those payments could be characterized as compensation for fraudulent activity, which elevated the exposure considerably from a civil standpoint and potentially from a criminal one. I asked him how long all of this would take. He said civil cases move at their own pace, but that the ethics complaint would generate a response within 60 days, and that the quality of the documentation we had made him confident about the outcome. I said I could wait 60 days. Raymond said he knew I could. He said most people couldn't, which was part of why most people ended up in worse positions than they needed to be. While all of this was developing, Sandra continued her HOA operations as though nothing had changed. Helen kept me informed. Sandra had blamed the wedding disaster publicly on what she called my deliberate act of agricultural vandalism, which was both legally inaccurate and, given my permits, effectively meaningless. She had submitted another nuisance complaint to the county, citing the June 14th fertilizer application as evidence of hostile farm management practices targeting the residential community. Raymond called that complaint a gift, because now we had documentation of Sandra filing a retaliatory nuisance complaint against a legal agricultural operation, specifically after that operation had disrupted her unauthorized use of my property. That sequence, the forged permit, the trespass, the disruption, the retaliatory complaint, told a story that was very clear to anyone reading it in order. Carla Simmons also found something I hadn't expected. She had been looking into the broader relationship between the development company and the county planning office, standard background work. And she found that 2 members of the county planning committee had received campaign contributions from entities connected to Clover Ridge Land Partners in the prior election cycle. Not enormous amounts, enough to be notable, enough to explain why the rezoning inquiry had been sitting in preliminary status without being formally dismissed, held open like a door that someone wanted to be able to push through later. Raymond took that to the county ethics office as a supplemental filing. By the time the 60-day ethics review concluded, the complaint had grown considerably beyond its original scope. The county ethics officer, a thorough man named George Talbot, who Raymond described as someone who took the job seriously precisely because most people assumed no one did, had expanded the inquiry to include the rezoning process irregularities and the planning committee contribution question. Sandra received formal notice of the ethics investigation in August. Helen called me 30 minutes after the certified letters were delivered in Clover Ridge. She said Sandra had been on her porch since the mailman left and hadn't moved in 20 minutes. I was in the barn sharpening blades when the call came in. I thanked Helen, finished sharpening the blade I was working on, and went back to the house for coffee. The ethics investigation ran 4 months. In November, George Talbot issued his findings. Sandra Peoples had submitted a fraudulent consent declaration on a county event permit application. She had submitted nuisance complaints that were found to be materially inaccurate in their characterizations of standard agricultural operations. Her documented financial relationship with Clover Ridge Land Partners during the period she was filing those complaints created a conflict of interest that the office characterized as corrupt use of the public complaint process. The planning committee members who had received contributions had their votes on land use matters within the development's geographic area of interest referred to the State Ethics Commission for further review. The rezoning inquiry was formally dismissed. My land's agricultural designation was confirmed and documented with additional protections added to the county record, given the demonstrated attempt to manipulate the process. Raymond filed civil suit in December. Sandra and Clover Ridgeland partners both. Fraudulent permit documentation, tortious interference with agricultural operations, abuse of process for the nuisance complaint campaign. The developer settled within 90 days, $240,000, a formal withdrawal of any future land use inquiries related to my parcel, and a recorded document placed in the county land records acknowledging my property's agricultural status and the settlement of all disputes. $240,000. My grandfather had bought this land for less than $2,000. Sandra did not settle as quickly. She fought for 6 months through an attorney who eventually, I think, had a very honest conversation with her about the weight of the documented evidence against her. She settled in the end. $40,000 in damages, removal from the HOA board, a 5-year prohibition on filing complaints or permit applications in the county while under consent agreement with the ethics office, and a formal letter of correction placed in the county permit record next to her original fraudulent application. She moved out of Clover Ridge 4 months after the settlement. I heard she went back to Atlanta. The Clover Ridge HOA, without Sandra running it, became a different organization. The new board reached out to me in spring of the following year. Polite letter, new stationery, different tone entirely. They wanted to discuss whether there were ways to improve the relationship between the subdivision and the farm. I met with them on my porch one Saturday morning. We talked for 2 hours. We agreed on a few simple things. I would give advance notice before major equipment operations near the shared fence line when possible. They would use proper channels if they had any concerns rather than county complaint systems. Reasonable people, reasonable conversation. That is all it ever needed to be. The East Meadow is still a meadow. I planted an additional 6 acres of soybeans there the following spring on ground that Sandra had stuck tent poles into. The cattle herd is up by 4 head from where it was when all this started. The farm is still a farm. Some Saturday mornings, when the light is right and the dew hasn't burned off the east field yet, I'll walk out to the fence line with coffee and look at those 6 acres of soybeans coming up green and even, and I'll think about the sequence of it. The forged permit, the wedding nobody got to attend, the tractor and the spreader and the northwest wind doing its patient 8-mile-an-hour work, the paper trail Raymond and Carla built while I kept farming. Sandra had looked at my land and seen something she could use. That's the simplest version of what happened. She saw open space and good light and a meadow that photographed well, and she decided that because she wanted it, it was somehow available to her. What she didn't see was that land with 100 years of family work in it doesn't yield to want. It yields to weather, to season, to the kind of slow, patient effort that isn't impressive to watch, but builds something that lasts. She came for a farm, she found a farmer. Here's what I'll leave you with. There's a version of this story where I confronted Sandra at the fence that morning in June, and it turned into a screaming match caught on a neighbor's phone that made me look like the problem. There's a version where I called the deputies before I started the spreader and spent 6 months in a slow county process getting nowhere. There's a version where I didn't read the permit notification carefully and the wedding happened and the paper trail kept building, and eventually my land lost its protections. Every one of those versions ends differently. Documentation is not exciting. Permits are not exciting. An attorney reading 2 years of county filings on a Saturday morning is not exciting. But those things built the case that got my land protected and put $240,000 back into this farm. That money went toward equipment, repairs on the barn roof, a college fund for my daughter's kids, and a scholarship in my father's name at the agricultural college 40 miles from here. Sandra wanted to take something from this farm. Instead, she funded it. Drop your thoughts below. And if someone's been filing paperwork against your property, your business, your life, thinking you won't notice or won't understand what it means, start reading those filings. Every one of them. Because the paper trail runs both directions.